This week on The Point, we look into how South Korea and Japan could normalize their bilateral relations deteriorated by a trade dispute ignited by Tokyo's export curbs through upcoming high-profile talks. The trade dispute between the two nations had begun in July when Japan retaliated against the South Korean Supreme Court's ruling on forced labor issue by imposing export regulations. In response to Japan's withdrawal of South Korea from its whitelist, Seoul scrapped Tokyo from its list of trusted trading partners and further announced to terminate GSOMIA, a military intel sharing pact signed with Japan. With Japan having shown no response to Korea's offer for talks, Seoul filed a WTO lawsuit over Tokyo's export curbs and let the global community know about Japan's violation of the free trade system. What seemed to be a perpetual deadlock between the two sides has seen small progress being made when South Korea announced to conditionally extend GSOMIA on November 22nd. Since Seoul's announcement, the two sides have agreed to dispatch their senior trade officials for talks and are also preparing to hold a bilateral summit. The world is setting its eyes to see whether Seoul and Tokyo could narrow their differences after such a prolonged trade dispute.
Hello, welcome to The Point. I'm your host, Daniel Che. Senior trade officials from South Korea and Japan are meeting for talks, and also a summit between the leaders of both sides will be held. So how will these developments affect bilateral ties moving forward? We'll turn to a number of experts for their take on the matter. So, let's get to the point. To help us dissect today's topic into digestible bites, we're joined by Song Se-ryun, Professor of Law from Kyung University, with us again. Thank you so much for making time for us. Good to have you back here again, Professor.
Good to see you again, Daniel.
Well, first of all, it looks like December 16 is a big day when the two nations will hold high-level talks. Good to see the two sides talking, and it is seen as a first step towards resolving the trade route, which has been ongoing for a long time.
Right, long time, as you said. I think it's a great time to kind of resume our relationship. It's a stated purpose of the meeting anyway, so I think that both parties cannot resolve everything at this point, but in terms of how the trade has been hampered and given the outlook of the world economy is not that great. Probably this is a good time for both parties agree that it's good to resume our trade.
And it's been a long time. The senior officials from both sides are meeting for the first time since 2016. So what does the overdue lapse mean in terms of the difference in the significance of this particular session?
Well, it started out as a historical spat, right? But in terms of how it has progressed, it seems like there are a lot of different factors in it. Some of it is domestic in the Japanese politics. Shinzo Abe's stated goal of amending constitution. All those has come in, and they're reacting to what Korean judiciary has done in terms of compensating for the victims. I think those complicated issues came out as a tactic to put trade restrictions. But I think it was a shaky ground to start with. So I think both parties want to have some kind of exit at this point to get back to the normal relationships as before.
Before we continue our conversation, we have prepared a special clip that we'd like to turn our attention to. This one is about taking a look back at how the trade dispute emerged between Korea and Japan and how far it got since then. We'll be back after this video.
Attention is being focused on whether South Korea and Japan could make a breakthrough to the 5-month trade dispute through the upcoming trade talks. The South Korean government announced to conditionally suspend expiry of GSOMIA and said it is open for talks with Japan on November 22nd. South Korean and Japanese officials met for working-level talks in Seoul on November 28th, followed by preparatory director-level talks in the Austrian capital of Vienna on December 4th. The two sides have agreed to hold another round of trade talks during the meeting.
지난 과장급 준비에 의해서 금방 국장급 준비에서도 우호적인 분위기에서 진정성인 대화를 했다고 생각하고 있습니다. 한일 간의 그런 수출 규제 조치라든지 이런 부분들이 좀 정상적으로 현안 해결을 위한 노력을 좀 해야 됐다는 점에 대해서는 인식을 같이 했다고 평가를 하고 있습니다.
South Korea and Japan have agreed to hold a Director General level meeting on December 16th in Tokyo. The South Korean delegation would be represented by Lee Ho-hyun, Director General for Trade Policy at the Trade Ministry. Yoichi Aida, Director General of the Trade Control Department at the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, would engage in talks on behalf of the host nation. Through the trade talks, the two sides are slated to exchange views on Japan's export curbs and how the two sides should cooperate in terms of controlling the exports of strategic materials and operating export regulation system moving forward. The two nations are planning a foreign ministerial meeting on the sidelines of a gathering of Asian and European foreign ministers in Madrid, slated from December 15th to 16th. The top diplomats will finalize the schedule and agenda for the upcoming bilateral summit. The South Korea-Japan summit is being set up on the sidelines of a trilateral summit between Seoul, Beijing and Tokyo from December 23rd to the 25th in China. Should the leaders of Seoul and Tokyo agree to meet one-on-one, it would be the first bilateral summit in 15 months since it happened on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly that took place in the United States last September. It remains to be seen whether the two sides could ride on the momentum and bring down the level of bilateral tensions.
Professor, back in July, Japan placed export curbs against South Korea, citing reasons like security regulation breaches or inability to comply by them. Will this system or the process be a key topic of discussion?
Right. There were kind of three reasons why the Japan put restriction on it. First is a deterioration of bilateral ties to lack of trade dialogues for a certain amount of time, which is what the point of having a dialogue this month anyway. But second is the South Korea's insecure measure to cover WMD-related items in its catch-all control. I don't think anybody understands where they're coming from, but there it is. And the third one is vulnerability of Korea's export review and management system. I think they're talking about the manpower, but it's something that we have kind of patched up a little.
So from Japan's perspective, South Korea has not been fulfilling these security obligations in terms of the trade relations. And of course, South Korea believes, and we have been doing a fairly good job. How do we meet somewhere in the middle or validate the fact that we have been fulfilling our obligations in terms of trade and security matters?
Right. As much as how shaky it sounds, I mean, that's my personal opinions, but those three bases have been fairly met because, first of all, we're having a meeting in the first place, so the first requirement of not having a dialogue for a long time, that's been already addressed. And also vulnerability of export review and management system, that has been addressed by having more manpower. So some of the measures, I think the Korea is quite confident at this point since they have already lodged a complaint with the WTO. When they go to have this kind of dialogues, probably they'll lay out what the Korea has done to address and pre-address actually those concerns. So in that sense, Japan probably will have to work very hard to find another excuses to prolong the trade restrictions if that was their sole purpose.
Will they retract their accusations of South Korea not being a trustworthy trade partner in terms of security?
I think that depends on the domestic situation in Japan. Shinzo Abe wants to look tough against Korea because that appeals better to his base. So I think my suspicion is that he'll be monitoring what the reaction is from the bases and how his approval rating goes up or down to see to determine his ultimate decision as to whether he will kind of come to the resolution early or he'll prolong the tough stance a little bit longer.
All right, let us extend our conversation to another expert who's joining us. An expert in Japan shares with us how Tokyo is reacting to the upcoming meeting. Stephen Arnagi, professor of Department of Politics and International Studies, International Christian University, joins us via Skype. Welcome to the program, Professor.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you back again. Senior trade officials of Korea and Japan will meet in December 16th in Tokyo. What is Japan expecting to accomplish through the upcoming event?
I think Tokyo is going to try and address some of the challenges that exist between the state. The first area that I think they would like to address is ensuring that the exports that potentially go to Korea will be strictly controlled, and they will ensure that those items don't go downstream to problematic characters within the region. And I think a couple areas that the Japanese are concerned is, where will the components go, and will they be going to North Korea? And of course, that's not going to happen directly through South Korea, but I think there's concern that the products go into Huawei products, and then the Huawei products eventually end up in North Korea. And there's been reports that Huawei has built a telecommunication system in North Korea. And again, this is a concern for Japan, because Japan's in the front line of North Korea's conventional missile systems, but also its non-conventional, or weapons of mass destruction.
Stephen, Seoul would ask for Tokyo to retract its export curbs and work together to resolve trade concerns. In what ways would Japan counter Korea's offers and narratives?
So I think that the way that Japan and South Korea can move forward on this particular area is to start to adopt shared norms and shared governance practices in terms of where imports and exports are going. And if this is an area that the South Koreans are willing to explore, I think that Tokyo might really exert some flexibility here, and that maybe some of the standards that are used in Japan can be adopted by South Korea. This is not abnormal. It's best practices, right? And South Korea is a vibrant economy. It's a competitive economy. And to adopt best practices is something that I think is in the interest of South Korea, but it would probably help contribute to dealing with this export ban that is existing right now.
In spite of the differences that remain, do you think Korea and Japan would be able to find middle ground?
So South Korea and Japan have many issues in common. And I think first and foremost, they're both concerned about the nuclearization process in North Korea. What is the direction of Kim Jong-un's leadership, and what is the kind of surprises that he's going to leave us with in 2019? And of course, what happens in 2020? I think there are also there's areas to cooperate in terms of trying to manage China's rise, and I think that there's some opportunities for synergy between the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and South Korea's Northeast Asia plus Alpha, in which they're focusing on infrastructure and connectivity. So I think that these are areas to work together, and they should try to find dialogue. In terms of dealing with other issues such as GSOMIA and trade, I think that some progress has been made with South Korea deciding not to stop the GSOMIA agreement, and I think more cooperation and dialogue is important there. And as North Korea tests both states and tests the trilateral relationship between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, that's going to be another area where they should cooperate, and they should find areas to work together. And lastly, on trade, I think the global slowdown is going to affect all partners within the region, and I think that they need to find ways to move forward on trade. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is one possibility. Moving forward on trilateral discussions in terms of an FTA between South Korea, Japan, and China is another area. And my viewpoint is that I think South Korea is an excellent candidate to join the CPTPP, or the TPP-11. And that these are all ways to build norms, to build trust. And I think that these are areas that both partners should work forward. Bringing South Korea into the agreement would bring heft to it, also create more norms, shared understandings, and joint leadership, which I think are great opportunities for South Korea and Japan.
All right. Thank you, Stephen, so much for your time and expertise on the matter. We appreciate it.
So thank you very much for having me. It's always great to be able to contribute to dialogue about Northeast Asia, and in particular about South Korea, Japan, and how they can work together for a more positive relationship.
We feel the same way, of course. Coming back to you, Professor Song, what do you make of what Professor Nagy spoke about, how Japan seems fixated on Korea having to validate its ability to live up to certain security standards that Japan believes Seoul has not been able to fulfill.
While I agree with Professor Nagy as a general tenet that both countries should work together on not only the security and also trade issues, but I think he's giving too much credit on the basis that Japan has raised in terms of security issues. I think those issues have not raised any kind of serious concerns before, and I think when it was raised, I don't think Japan has stressed in any strategic terms the dangers of the sensitive information going to North Korea. There's just no basis. I mean, having said that, I think the given provocations that North Korea is having, probably it's a good idea to work together on both parties, not only Japan and Korea, but also United States. So if it's stressing on the importance of our alliance, not only the information, but the other security matters in this region, yeah, I'm for it. But the methodologies of addressing that, I don't think it was a good idea for Japan to raise trade restrictions.
Right, and some experts would say there are other issues between the two sides that's interconnected with the trade matters.
Right. I mean, the deeper issue is always a historical issue, and that's not going to be resolved anytime soon. But immediately, I think Japan has had the domestic issues in terms of how Shinzo Abe is pushing for the reform in the Japanese economy, but also politically trying to amend the constitution to, in his terms, normalize the nation. That has a tight schedule at this point. During his term, that means less than 2 years away, and he needs to drive up the approval rating to get over the hump to get to national voting. So in that terms, I think he's driving it too hard.
So let's look at the picture in the eyes of a foreign economist this time. Wakas Adanwala, Asia analyst at the EIU, is joining us via Skype to share his insights. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Wakas, a trade dispute ignited by Tokyo's export curbs 6 months ago is deteriorating Korean and Japanese economies. How is the rest of the Asia viewing this trade spat?
So most of Asia is maintaining a neutral stance. Obviously, there's certain economies like Singapore, which are also integrating into the supply chain for high-tech and semiconductors. They would prefer if South Korea and Japan would have resolved the dispute earlier. But most of Asia is obviously maintaining a fairly neutral stance. They have close economic ties to Japan and South Korea, so they prefer not to take a side. Again, there are countries like Taiwan which are benefiting in a way because they have a lot of their own homegrown semiconductor industries, such as TSMC. China, for its own political reasons and diplomatic reasons, has a different view on it too. But by far, a vast majority of other Asian countries have not taken any particular side.
Ms. Nadanwala, what would be the main topic of discussion during the meeting between the two nations' trade officials?
So, most likely the two trade official parties are going to stick to topics of trade and not much else beyond that. So obviously they will be talking about WTO complaints that they've raised against each other, or export curbs that Tokyo imposed on South Korea, and how can South Korea actually make sure that those curbs are removed by Japan. Beyond that, obviously, they'll also be talking about how can they actually make sure that they can get back onto each other's whitelist too. So it will be a whole drawn process, but they will start off with the basic steps. So getting back onto whitelist will not be easy, but first and foremost, we'll be talking about WTO and, again, the export curbs Japan has placed on South Korea.
Do you anticipate positive outcomes from the long overdue senior trade officials meeting and a bilateral summit slated for later this month?
So I think definitely positive steps have been taken, firstly via South Korea, obviously by not scrapping GSOMIA agreement at the 11th hour. But I also don't expect the relations to completely normalize. South Korea and Japan are both aware of the common threat they face in the region, which is North Korea. So yes, they are motivated by addressing their common concerns. But again, both must be reminded that yes, they have to work towards a common goal of actually helping their export-oriented economies, especially in light of the trade war that's been going on in the region. So definitely expect some some positive steps, but I don't expect complete normalization of relations anytime soon.
Right. Thank you so much, Wakas, for your contribution today. We do appreciate them.
Thank you so much for having me on your show again.
Well, coming back to you, Professor, it looks like our contributor Wakas Adumada is expecting this to be one of many more necessary meetings to come.
Right. I think he appreciates the complexity of the relationship between Korea and Japan. Not only the historical issues, but trade issues and also GSOMIA related security issues are all lumped together along with the Japan's stated goal of changing the country in certain directions. However, I think that in the short term, I think that the outlook might be a little bit more positive than what he has been perceiving, because both countries have a willingness to patch up and move forward in terms of economic relationships. So in that sense, the hard questions of history and all those things might be a little bit pushed behind if the both parties have their ways, especially as the summit meetings are coming up.
Right. They do have so much similarities, yet different in many ways. They can clash overnight, and they can resolve the differences in a rather short amount of time. We believe that is possible, and especially since we do have, as you mentioned, a very important meeting between the leaders of South Korea and Japan coming up.
Right. This is a great opportunity for the summit to get together and have a high-level talk. A high-level talk meaning setting aside all those differences, we can work together. And I think that should be the message. I think the rest of the world is looking at this region not only as just two countries, but as a driving engine, especially in the high-tech area. So economically, it is important for the rest of the world, and in terms of security and peace, it's important for the rest of the world. So in that sense, both the presidents and both head of the states have a very important message for the rest of the world if they can set aside the differences.
Judging by the changes so far with the changing, I suppose, the geopolitical atmosphere between not just South Korea and Japan, but the rest of the world, and the fact that the leaders actually did more than just pose for photos looking in the opposite direction, do you sense some renewed positivity in the upcoming summits?
Again, both parties are willing, I think. And I think Korea has met their requirement. As I mentioned, there were 3 stated bases for the trade restrictions, and I think we met most of them. So they have, if they are looking for excuses to patch up a relationship, there they are. So in that sense, going back to the important messages for the rest of the world, I think that the President Moon and Shinzo Abe has to sit together and think about the rest of the world and also look to the future so that our relationship and cooperative relationship at that would resume and continue.
Right. Sometimes top-down diplomacy is necessary and urgently needed, and the world will be watching closely. Looks like we have run out of time. We look forward to having you back here again, Professor. We appreciate you coming in and making our program complete today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
It's time for Seoul and Tokyo to remind themselves there's too much to lose through continued disputes. With a renewed sense of urgency, they must put in utmost efforts to resolve the conflict through the upcoming meetings. That's all we have for you at this hour. Do join us again same time next week for a brand new episode of The Point. Thank you for watching.